Welcome to Three Devs and a Maybe. Now introducing your show hosts, Michael Budd, Fraser Hart, Lewis Caines, and Ed Mann.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Three Devs and a Maybe. My name's Ed Mann, and today we're joined again by Mattias Geniar. How you doing, Mattias?
Hi Ed, I'm fine. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Long time no speak. I was actually looking back through the lot for our podcast. It was like 2015. That's years ago.
Is that really 2 years? I thought it was like last year.
I know. Honestly, I felt the same way. I was thinking it must have been last year, but it was December of 2015. So I was like, wow, how time has flown.
Exactly. We were discussing HTTP 2, and that's like totally passé now. It's the past.
Absolutely. Well, and also I think it was the first time I was listening back to it. It's the first time you tried out your Yeti, and now obviously you've started a podcast yourself and everything. So no, it's been a very busy time.
Yeah, but the Yeti's been a bit rusty, by the way. But it's good to clear the old lady off and talk to it again.
Oh no, brilliant. Well, we definitely have to talk about all this. It'll be really interesting. But yeah, so I mean, the first thing I'd like to say, maybe for the audience, it'd be great to kind of, if they haven't listened to the previous show, is to kind of maybe a little general background about yourself.
Okay. Well, my name is Mattias. I'm a lot of things at once. I'm both a developer. I'm a sysadmin. I do open source. I'm a manager at Nucleus. We're a Belgian hosting provider. I have side projects. I blog, I podcast, I write newsletters. I also have a wife and two lovely kids. And somewhere in between, I try to nap a few times and get some sleep. But that's a luxury I can't afford right now. So who needs sleep anyway?
I was thinking, with all those hats, I doubt you get much sleep.
Yeah, but that's what coffee is for, right? That's what
absolutely. That is why caffeine was invented.
Exactly.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, but I just thought, because as you say, we were talking about HTTP 2 last time, and kind of carrying on in that vein, one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about, due to like your blogging, and actually it sparks up from, you did a talk about Varnish actually on Laravel EU conference last year. So I really wanted to get you on to talk about Varnish. And I was just say, I really liked your Laravel conference talk. Just wondering, like, how did that go? Did you enjoy the experience?
I loved it. I think it was the biggest audience I ever had for a talk. It was over 200 people, which is odd because whenever I give a talk, I'm always nervous as hell. I stumble through my lines. I get sweaty all the time. But then if you see an audience of 200 people, it becomes so much, and there are lights in your face, and then all of a sudden it just looks like you're alone on a stage, which is really, really odd. So there's this fine line between, if you're talking to 50 people, you're probably stressing all the way through, but then once that audience grows, it becomes so unpersonal that you can just talk and talk and talk, and it doesn't matter anymore. Just a really strange experience. But I really liked giving the talk. Varnish as a tech tool, as well as technology, is really interesting to talk about. It's both complicated and challenging, so it's a fun and thankful topic to be presenting about.
Now, I was going to say, you did not sound nervous at all on the recording, and that's another thing, it was recorded as well, just for added extra pressure.
Oh great, now people can watch it.
No, it was perfect, man, honestly. And it's very, as you say, it's very interesting. Then you say that obviously in a smaller room, you get to see people's faces, you may be a bit more personal with people, but as you say, you go to that scale and it all just desensitizes, and you just have no kind of, you are on your own. Yeah,
exactly, which is same like this. We're talking one-on-one, but there are probably more than one people going to listen to this. So this is more personal, and it is giving me more, stress, I think, in a way. Whereas if you were an audience of 200 people, it would be so unpersonal. I could just walk off stage and nobody could see me again. And it's a really different experience. But I loved giving the talk there. Very grateful that they allowed me to give a talk. So thank you, Laracon. I hope to be there in a few years as well.
And yeah, speaking about the topic then that you actually discussed, Varnish, what does Varnish solve then?
Well, I'll start by giving a quick summary of Varnish, what it is and what it can do. It can do a lot of things. So to start, Varnish is software that you can install on your server. It acts a bit like a web server. It's a service that will run, and it acts as a reverse proxy. So if you were supposed to be running, say, your Apache as your web server, listening on port 80 and handling all of your HTTP traffic, Varnish would sit in between and it would start listening on port 80 and then proxy everything transparently without anyone noticing it actually to your Apache running on a different port. So Varnish sits in between all of the visitors to your website and the web server that is actually serving all of the traffic, the PHP, the request handling, etc. And what it's trying to solve is trying to make the web more efficient. So their slogan of Varnish is that it's an HTTP accelerator, which is a really good word because it actually speeds up the web. So the idea of Varnish is that it caches requests, or in a way more of the responses of those requests. So whenever someone visits a website, if I browse a site and you visit it a few seconds later, chances are we'll be looking at the same exact website. There's no need to have PHP running, doing all of its queries, then getting some kind of memcached or Redis caching going. In the end, we're going to be looking at the exact same HTML being outputted. And that is what Varnish is for. So it lets the web server do its thing. It generates HTML and then it stores that in memory so that if you go to the website, it's going to be heavy for you because all the database queries have to be run, all the object storage has to be hit. But if I go to again, then Varnish will have that same HTML page in memory and it'll be served in milliseconds instead of maybe seconds to be generated. So the purpose of Varnish is really to speed things up, avoid repetitive and the same calculations being done on the back end.
Yeah, and it's all about like trying to give your main application server a break. Anything that can be cached and dealt with and sent off, because speed is, as you say, paramount. That we want to get it out to the a response out to them as soon as possible.
Yeah, exactly, and that's where Varnish actually shines. If you're looking at a typical PHP application, if it's written well, you'll probably see response times between 100 and 300 milliseconds. If it's written badly, let's say you're looking at a default WordPress or a Drupal website, it might take a few seconds to load. When you put Varnish in between and when you configure it accurately, which is an asterisk on its own, you're looking at response times between 2 and 5 milliseconds. So you're shaving off hundreds of milliseconds per hit. And when done correctly, you should see your CPU and memory just drop to near zero on the web server because it doesn't have that much to do anymore.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. And I mean, for everything, for costs with, infrastructure to the fact of, faster speed, it's almost one of these like amazing magical things that can, help you. Obviously, it doesn't come without a cost. You have to set it up, you have to configure it correctly, and you really have to kind of change your way of thinking in some regard. One thing I'd like to really like to ask you actually is kind of how does Varnish go about doing this? Like what headers and things does it kind of deal with, and how does it go about the actual caching process, deciding on what to cache and when to cache it and for how long?
That is both extremely complicated and extremely simple. So I'll start with the simple explanation, which is how it should work in theory, but how it doesn't actually work in practice. So the idea of Varnish is that it listens to requests coming in from your visitors for a website, and it looks at all of the HTTP headers that everyone is sending. Those headers will include if you are able to accept compressed content or not, if you're looking at an API, what kind of request you'd like, if it's JSON or XML, those kind of headers are all metadata describing the request you want to do, and it'll pass that on to the backend, and the backend, your PHP, your Ruby, your Node application, will do its thing, generate a response, and give that back to Varnish with, again, a set of headers to describe what kind of response it's giving back. In those headers, there, in theory, should contain things like cache headers that determine how and if a request or a response can be cached. So if all of this goes according to plan and according to all the RFCs being made, then Varnish is really simple because it only has to listen to whatever the client is requesting and whatever the server is responding. But things get a bit tricky because it has to know that you and me visiting a different or the same website can be served the same response. So if you're looking at say, Facebook and I'm looking at Facebook, chances are we're looking at a different kind of Facebook. But our request may look very similar. We're just browsing facebook.com and we're expecting a response. However, you're logged in, I'm logged in, and the differentiator here between what you're seeing and what I'm seeing is going to be decided by geolocation on one hand, cookies being sent because you're logged in and I'm logged in on the other hand. Your browser may trigger different kind of responses from the backend than my browser. You might be blocking certain things. So what looks like the same request on the surface is deep down a completely different hit, and it's triggering completely different behavior on the backend. So that's what I mean with Varnish in theory versus Varnish in practice. In theory, it just needs to listen to the HTTP headers that a client is sending and a server is responding with. But in practice, that doesn't cut it, because every header, every request is unique in its own kind of way. So that is where Varnish introduces its VCL, a Varnish configuration language. It's a C kind of language where you can manipulate every incoming and outgoing request in Varnish. So you can write if statements, you can drop hits, you can rewrite URLs. You can pretty much tamper with the HTTP protocol the way you like. And that is where the power of Varnish comes in, and where the trap of Varnish comes in, because it's so easy to get lost in there and decide that the entire applications can be written in the VCL, which is a fun practice. It's fun mind games, but in theory that doesn't really work. So if you're looking at what Varnish does for caching, well, it looks at the HTTP headers that the backend sets. So by default, that should be things like a cache control header, where you can say that if a response is going to be a public or a private property, and additionally for how many seconds it can be cached. So if you're looking at a site and it responds with a 30-second cache control header, every visitor requesting the same kind of object will get the same hit in 30 seconds, and Varnish will keep that in mind as the TTL, the time to live. Drop the object as soon as the timer expires, and then request a single object from the backend again. So it's smart about it, but in practice it doesn't really work the way it should in theory. So that's where the complexity comes in.
I think, yeah, as you say, you're completely right with that, where, you know, on the surface, my facebook.com URI and your facebook.com URI, you know, they're the same. Hey, we can cache the same things, but obviously context and the fact of my session being different, and really those responses are completely different. And, you know, there could be this scary game where, you know, if you do incorrectly do it, Varnish can cache other people's authenticated requests and deliver them to other people. And in fact, you know, other things such as, you know, they can cache invalid requests such as 500 responses and give them to a lot of people when, you know, they weren't, you know, maybe not doing it like that. You know, it was just the fact that that first cache hit was a problem with that. That cache fetch was a problem. So I was, you know, one of the things then that you mentioned is the fact of like cookies and, you know, the fact of sessions and things. And, you know, those I think are the ones that those are the start to get into this whole game of, you know, how to cache things, and, you know, the idea of, oh, you know, I need to strip cookies from things. You know, a lot of a request that we typically think, you know, a browser request, you don't realize how much other stuff is actually going in that request, you know, when it goes down the wire onto the server. And one of them is the cookies that you actually have for that browser. You know, it could be Google Analytics cookies, it could just be session cookies, it could be your Laravel cookie, your session, you know, Symfony cookie, whatever. How does Varnish manage these cookies? Does it take that into consideration when it's doing its caching?
Absolutely, which is also, so Varnish by default looks at three different things to determine a cache hit or a cache miss. So if you look at Varnish conceptually, it's basically a big key value store where the protocol to talk to it is HTTP. So keys get stored and they get a value in it, value being just the HTML response of an HTTP request. And the key is dynamically determined. You can override it, you can tweak it the way you like. By default, a hash or a key in Varnish is going to be determined by the host header you're browsing with. So let's take facebook.com as an example. Facebook.com would be the host that you're browsing to. It would look at the URL, so /account/me, for instance. And then it would look at the cookies that are being set by your browser. And those three parameters are basically what sets my and your HTTP request apart. So looking at those, that also means if you're logged in and I'm logged in, we each have a different session ID, hopefully. That also means that our caching is going to be wildly different. Every time I refresh, I will see my version. If you refresh, you'll see yours. But that doesn't really add much to the efficiency of Varnish, because if that's the case, why even bother putting in a reverse proxy in the first place? Doesn't really help much. So Varnish mostly helps in those unauthenticated scenarios. Looking at a news website where 95% of all its visitors are just people looking at the news, but they're not logged in. each of those is going to get the same kind of response, because nine times out of 10, they won't have cookies or have a limited set of cookies, which means that the hash in Varnish, or the key in its key value storage, is going to be the same for all of those people. But where it gets tricky, and where I learned a lot about the HTTP protocol, is in the way that cookies get handled and set within the browser. So it's very interesting just to go to, let's say, google.com, right-click the page, inspect, and go to the network tab, hit refresh a couple of times and see what cookies you're getting and what cookies you're sending on each request. It's actually quite a lot, because it's not just the cookies that your website is setting, like the session ID in a Laravel application. Every time that you add a third-party tracker, let's say you add Discuss for comments, you add some Google Analytics to track your visitors, each of those adds JavaScript to your site and can set cookies on your own domain. So each of those cookies, even though you didn't actually request them because they're not part of your app, the third-party JavaScript can set it on your domain. And from now on, every visitor refreshing your page is going to send all of those cookies to your site as well. But that complicates the whole notion of caching, because suddenly you have a third party that you don't really control from beginning to end adding cookies to your site. Those cookies are interfering with the hash or the key in its key value store, and suddenly you're invalidating cache with every refresh. So that's where the complexity of Varnish mostly comes in. You have to understand the HTTP protocol, what goes on when cookies get set, that they are actually being sent on every request, including images or CSS or JavaScript. And once you get the hang of that, you can start tweaking it. You can start dropping cookies that are irrelevant for the cache, Google Analytics being a good one. Usually doesn't matter that much on the back end what your ID of Google Analytics is. And then you can look at whitelisting or blacklisting cookies, depending on whichever use case you have to handle those cookies. But that's where it comes in handy to understand the HTTP protocol and to know what happens when you send a request and how do cookies even get set in the first place. Things like that. The inspect tab becomes your close friend whenever you're interacting with Varnish.
Absolutely, completely concur there, and I think it is very eye-opening, to see, like you say, how these cookies are built up and how order isn't determinate. You can't rely on the fact of maybe I do one request and I do another request, they've got the same cookies in, but they're in a different order, and all these kind of things where you want to get to the same hash and you want to make sure that you lose anything that really doesn't matter, like the Google Analytics cookies. One thing I would like to ask is, what's your preference towards like whitelisting and blacklisting cookies? Because there's a lot of kind of pros and cons to both, but where do you kind of side with that?
I think if you're just getting started with Varnish, blacklisting cookies is going to be the easiest, because there are a lot of examples on the internet on how to remove cookies by copy-pasting the same old regular expression over and over again. But it's very readable. You can really understand what happens, and if a cookie matches that expression, it gets removed. It's visual, it's copy-pastable, which, it has its own value, of course, but it doesn't scale, obviously, because if you're adding third-party JavaScript to your site, and let's say it's Discuss for comments, if they decide that they want to add additional cookies and you don't know about those, they'll get added to your site. They won't be removed because you're blacklisting cookies, and this might not be a pattern that you foresaw. And suddenly your cache strategy breaks entirely because, just your hash is different again for every request. So blacklisting is very easy to get started with, but in the end, it doesn't really scale. It gives you a bit of an uncertainty that you don't know how your site or your application is going to act tomorrow or next week, because you don't know what's going to happen. Whitelisting, on the other hand, is safer. It's in the end, it'll end up being a very close tie between the Varnish configuration and your application, because every time you want to add new cookies to your site, you're going to have to whitelist them in Varnish by means of adding them to, again, some sort of regular expression block that you copy-paste. And everything that doesn't match is going to automatically get dropped, which is safe. Every time that you add a new cookie, you have to explicitly enable it in your VCL. Every time that a random site adds a cookie, it won't hurt you because you're whitelisting it, and everything that doesn't match gets removed automatically. But it gives you a really close tie-in between the VCL, the Varnish config, and your application. Whereas if you're looking at some kind of CDN that happens to be built on Varnish, you might not have that flexibility because it has to cater to a lot of type of requests, and you can't really determine the hash and cookie strategy for that. So there are, as you mentioned, pros and cons to each approach. For getting started with Varnish and just playing with it and seeing how it reacts and responds, I think blacklisting is the easiest way to get started with. Whitelisting is technically possible with a couple of hacks, but there are extensions to Varnish called vmods or Varnish mods. Those are basically binary extensions that you can load. Consider them like in Apache you had mod PHP or mod deflate, so actual modules being loaded. They give you some more control about how the type of functions that you get within the VCL. One of them is a cookie vmod that allows you to explicitly manage and more easily white and blacklist cookies in Varnish. Because if you're looking at the inspector and you see the kind of headers that are being sent, a cookie header sent from a client to a server is basically one really big line with... It's not pretty. And if you try to parse it, it is so error prone. Either actual key equals value pairs, and then there's a colon. But then if your value actually also contains a colon, things get really interesting. So it gets tricky to parse it with just regular expressions, which is where vmods, the Varnish mods, actually come in and help you with usable functions to filter those kinds of cookies.
You've touched upon there like the VCL configurations, that's been used in Varnish and how powerful it is, and using the regular expressions and stuff. I definitely won't ask, kind of to explain it in depth, because you do a really good job in your presentation to kind of explain and show the power of kind of, I think you went from like a one request down to show like kind of all the different hooks and stuff you could do, or many of them, and showing kind of, what a request could look like and how you could really mess it up and switch it around and change it within Varnish, and, then to give it to the actual back end. But it'll be really interesting to kind of know the general overview of the common hooks and stuff that you'll generally deal with in the life cycle of a request.
Yeah, sure. In Varnish, I think if you're getting started with it, there are 3 areas that are very important. I think in overall, there are around 20 different types of hooks that you can hook into to manipulate where a request is being set or removed, or where cookies are being handled. But if you're just getting started with it and you want like 80% of the functionality of Varnish, 3 areas stand out. One is the receive hook, which is, if you're looking at Varnish as a black box, it's where every request comes in. So every HTTP call that I make to a website would go into Varnish, and that is the first area where you can write code, because in the end VCL is just C-like code. If you're used to writing PHP, it'll look really familiar. So it's code where you can manipulate what comes in. You can remove URL patterns. You can add, edit HTTP headers. You can really toy with the request that comes in. You can make it look like you're browsing to facebook.com and modify the request so that it's actually twitter.com. But that's where the receive hook comes in. After the receive hook is where Varnish can do a lookup in its cache to see if it already has a value for the page you're requesting, which is where the hashing comes in, because the hashing algorithm, that key value idea of where you can decide what the key is going to be for your hit or your request, you can modify that. You can add headers, you can remove headers. If you don't like cookies being part of the hash, you can just decide to drop that entirely and just look at the host header and the URL. If you're looking at a static website, for instance, that might be a very valid strategy. But that's the hash. So that is where you determine the key of your request being looked up. And on the other hand, of course, you have whatever it is that your backend is going to send back to your client. So the PHP application has done its thing. It has generated an HTML response with occurring HTTP headers. And that is being set back to Varnish, and that you can also manipulate. The most common idea here is that you could override a time to live for a particular request. For instance, if your backend did not set any cache control headers, you could say that, okay, Varnish, you have not received a cache control, but trust me, I know what I'm doing. Accept that this URL is going to be cached for 10 minutes. And it allows you to, even though the application might not support it, override the headers that an application is sending back. Which is the big power of Varnish, I think. It allows you to play man in the middle in the most real sense of the word. You're holding an HTTP request and a response in your hand, and you can juggle with it the way you like, and you can modify it, and you can make an HTTP 200 call look like a 404 for your end user. You can play with it, but with great power comes great responsibility. I've shot myself in the foot more than once, and it's really easy to do.
I think, yeah, that's exactly it. And I think, the power does come at, a price. And I was wondering, like, how do you go about then testing these VCL configurations? Because as they're so powerful, you really want to make sure that they work before you put them in production. How do you go about doing that?
Well, this is the embarrassing part. It's really hard to test a VCL. So what I usually do is, at work, we are heavy users of Vagrant and Puppet. So we can test a lot of our configurations in a safe VirtualBox environment, but it's not the same. It doesn't give you the same feeling of getting the same amount of hits per second because, it's Vagrant, it's a virtual machine. You're not going to get production traffic there. And testing it usually involves running it with curl and then setting or removing headers command line, which is fine for basic testing, but if you're trying to test entire scenarios of logging in, uploading an image, cropping an image, and logging back out, you're not going to do that with curl. So a strategy that I like, but is also very dangerous, is writing if statements in my VCL that match particular headers that I set. For instance, if I add my browser a custom header saying, "Hi, I'm Mattias," and you can just write an if statement that if that header matches, "Hi, I'm Mattias," trigger different kind of VCL logic. So I can fake my own kind of requests, making my request unique and triggering different kind of logic in Varnish. Another strategy would be just looking at the IP address that comes in. If it's your IP address, then you trigger a different routine versus the rest of the traffic. But it's a bit of a cowboy style way of working, I think. I've yet to find a really good strategy. If you have the luxury of having some kind of staging and production environment, you can play all you like on a staging environment without hurting anyone. Most of us don't actually have that, so we're stuck with if statements to separate my own hits versus those of legitimate clients.
Yeah, I think we found that having that staging environment is the only way at this time of really testing it. The trouble is, because of how powerful it is, and you do have a response and a request in your hand, you essentially can just take down the whole site within one line, if that, and you don't know until you put it into production, you see the result, because there is no test kind of infrastructure around it. That's, there seems to be like around Puppet and things like that, but this seems to be kind of one of those missed opportunities.
Exactly. And I think having a test versus production environment, we have one client right now whose production environment is on an infrastructure level 100% alike from their acceptance for their testing environment. But in a production environment, they do things like Google Analytics tracking, which they don't do in a testing environment. But in Varnish, that makes a huge difference, because those adding random cookies might completely destroy a caching strategy that was validated and was confirmed to be working in a testing environment. So there's always going to be the unknown about a production environment where you don't know what kind of hits you're going to be coming in. You've got Google bots, you've got Bing bots crawling the website, doing all sorts of crazy things that you don't have on a testing environment. So it's really hard to test this accurately without resorting in the end to if statements matching particular headers to get different routines going.
It's this kind of idea that, your VCL logic then really comes very tied into what your application logic is because of this, this dealing with different cookies and how the structure of things, and you can do rewriting of URLs in Varnish and all these great things and great powerful tools. But, it goes in the aid of like, well, how are you going to test this? How are you going to release this and be confident that it's working? One of the things I'd love to talk to you about is kind of the balance between, how do you kind of balance the the routing, the caching logic within Varnish, and then like the backend web server, and then also the application logic? Because not only do you have the level now of your Varnish that then goes to maybe Apache or Nginx that then could do some rewriting itself, and then also back to the actual PHP application logic or any ambiguous application that you're actually going to. How do you balance this and partition it? Are you quite dumb in your caching logic in Varnish, or do you like to say, no, I'm going to use a lot of Varnish magic?
I think this ties into the whole practice versus theory of Varnish. In theory, Varnish works out of the box without any different changes because it can just listen to HTTP headers being set by the application. But that's theory, and that's also the way that I prefer it. In the end, a dumb varnish, a varnish that does not have a lot of logic where requests and responses get manipulated, is the best kind of varnish because you don't have to maintain it, you don't have to look at it. All strategies revolving around caching can be maintained and developed and tested from within the application. Say you have a Laravel application, you determine what headers are being set for your cache control. So in order to determine if a request or a response can be cached, and if so, for how long. It is very powerful to have that control as a developer in the application itself, where it's easy to manipulate and determine what your response should be, versus if you do it in a VCL, it's not always that easy to control and manage. In the end, you have to log into a server, edit a config file. Let's say that you do it by hand. So you log in as root, you vim it, you test some changes, you reload Varnish, and you hope that it works. It's a really different, it's a difficult scheme to get going without downtime. So the best case scenario is a dumb Varnish that has absolutely no logic, where all logic is being handled inside of the application. But that's the best case scenario, and in the end, that's not how it works. I maintain a lot of boilerplate Varnish configurations. Think of it as HTML5 boilerplate, but then for Varnish. And it contains a lot of normalization that you also see in HTML that just gets reused again and again. So every time that you have to strip Google Analytics cookies, it gets boring really fast. So there's one template that you can just use as a baseline, which sorts the URL parameters, it drops cookies that are irrelevant, it normalizes different kind of HTTP headers, so that you get a sort of a sane baseline to get going. Which is a shame, because that also means that there is logic within the VCL that will or might interfere with the way your application works. But I think that's just going to be the way it is. In best case scenario, it's as little as possible, but I don't think you can get around with getting some kind of application logic within a VCL.
And I think, let's say using something like your configuration templates, which I really do like a lot, it's in a maintained resource, at least. It's not a copy and paste from a website where you just forget about it and it's a buggy one that isn't, this has been tried, true, and tested by you and by many other people. So at least then there's a community around it, similar to like how well that HTML5 boilerplate did, where there's a community around it.
Exactly. Full disclosure, the HTML5 boilerplate is slightly more popular than my Varnish configurations. But it's really helpful that the community, and even though Varnish is a really small community, but dedicated folks, they spot bugs before I spot them, or they run into them, unfortunately, and fix them so I don't have to run into them. Lots of things around. If tomorrow Chrome Canary does a funky new release and it starts setting new headers that I did never foresee, someone else can go ahead and fix it and normalize everything in the config. A good example is, I think it's already a few years ago that there was a proxy vulnerability being disclosed where you could set additional headers in your browser or in your application that could trick a web server to send requests to a rogue proxy. It was really easy to manipulate by just setting additional headers in every request. This was patched within, I think, a couple of days by just adding a single line of Varnish configuration, because it sits in the middle of every request. It just drops all of those HTTP headers that it sees coming in. But that's good, because I never had to think about it and someone else did all the work for me. Same applies to if Google Analytics tomorrow starts adding new random cookies. Someone else can go ahead and pull request that, and your baseline can be sane again.
No, that's brilliant. Absolutely. And like you say, because it's this reverse proxy in the middle, anything like any kind of vulnerability that is, on your web server, the Nginx, the Caddy, I suppose you would use Caddy in front of it maybe, but, those kind of things and the Apaches, you could, you are safe from. I suppose then what's really thing is the front line is now Varnish. And I'm just wondering kind of like what tools are there then to monitor your Varnish instance?
There are a few, and they're all as geeky as you might think. There's a couple of command line tools. Well, basically everything that you practically do in Varnish is going to be command line. There are web interfaces that can give you assistance or help you, but at the end of the day, you're going to be logging into a server with SSH and running command line tools to debug whatever it is that is going on. There are a couple of interesting tools that Varnish offers out of the box. One is interesting, but at the end of the day, utterly pointless. It's called Varnish Hist. It gives you a histogram of all of the requests coming in and out of Varnish. Basically, you have to know is that Varnish doesn't log anything on disk, because Varnish was meant to be fast and provide performance and scalability. Disk access is inherently the slowest part of any server. So every request coming in or every request being sent out is all in memory. Nothing gets persisted on disk. So all of the debugging and logging tools that Varnish offers, they hook into a shared memory buffer, which is a piece in memory of your server where Varnish sort of dumps all of those logs. And it can read those. So Varnish Hist is the histogram, which gives you a really cool looking, looks like the New York skyline, just mountains and skyscrapers that they represent the hits and responses that your website is doing. It will show you lines or hashtags for hits or misses, and it can give you in a bird's eye view an idea of how your Varnish is doing. If you're seeing a lot of pipe signs, so the vertical lines, chances are your web server or your Varnish is doing okay, because those are all cache hits, and the more hits you have, the happier you should be. But at the end of the day, that doesn't give you much to debug on. It's a good idea for the first 10 seconds to see, are you caching anything or not? But then the next question is, what are you caching and what aren't you caching? And that's where Varnish Hist, basically you drop that and you go on to the next tool, which is going to be Varnish Log. And that is a raw log of everything coming in and out of a server. So every HTTP header being sent and every HTTP header being sent back to the client is going to be shown on your screen. So on average, I think if let's go back to Facebook. If you go to Facebook, it'll probably load something like 50 different images or CSS or JavaScript. Each of those is going to have 10 headers. Just opening Varnish Log on a terminal is going to scroll really, really fast and not be very, very eligible or legible. So you're going to be looking at filters to manipulate only your hits, for instance, or only the backend fetches, those misses. It's powerful, but it's really confusing output. You need at least that basic HTTP understanding to know what you're looking at, because those are the raw headers. You're seeing exactly every HTTP header being sent and every HTTP header being sent back to the client. But I think Varnish Log is the most powerful tool to be debugging with, albeit the most complicated, because it drops you right in the middle of the protocol.
No, absolutely. And actually, you mentioned on your blog something called Varnish Agent, which seems to be like a GUI web application front end for Varnish to kind of unlock some of its features. I'm just wondering, like, have you used that in production at all, or was that mainly just to kind of, like, this looked quite interesting?
Mostly the latter. I saw it get mentioned by the Varnish project and thought, hey, this looks interesting, let's give it a go. And it's really easy to install. It takes less than 5 minutes, I think. And what it gives you is a basic admin interface for your Varnish. So it gives you a web interface that you can log into, which has a couple of forms you can fill in to invalidate caches, so to remove content from your cache. You have an inline edit for your VCL. Although it's pretty sane, it tries to load it, and if the generation of the VCL fails, it won't go any further. So you can shoot yourself in the foot by just removing all your caching altogether, but I don't think you can actually crash Varnish. So in that sense, it's semi-okay. I think it's a good playground to get started with Varnish. But at the end of the day, you're going to be looking at integrating Varnish into your application somehow. You're not going to log into the Varnish agent every time you want to flush a cache, for instance. You're going to look at some kind of integration from within the app. So you quickly look past the agent, I think. I haven't found a good use case for me to keep it going.
Oh, that's interesting. That's good to know. And actually, you mentioned there caching and actually removing caches items, because obviously, this ever building up of a cache, we've got finite memory, and it's what to actually keep. How does Varnish go about doing that?
There are basically two ways to get cache invalidation going. So there's the always running joke that cache invalidation is one of the hardest things. I think that once you start to work with Varnish, that quickly becomes apparent that that is actually the case. So there are two ways to actually do it. One is called by sending an explicit purge request to Varnish, which is an HTTP call, but instead of doing a get or a post or a put method, you can use the purge method and then add additional logic within Varnish that receives a purge method and then goes ahead and purges content that matches that URL, which is a very good or an easy way to get started with purging your particular URLs or whatever, but it's also very, very limited. It's limited in the sense that it's really hard to say which kind of variations of a particular page you want to purge. So I may want to purge the /en/account page, but there may be different variations of that page because it's being handled by cookies to determine how many permutations there are of that page. But you can't really purge all of those variations of a page easily via the purge method. The good thing about this, though, is sending a purge to Varnish will immediately remove the object from the cache and free the memory. This may sound logic, but there's a different method for handling cache invalidation, which is called banning. And banning is a more passive way of removing objects from your cache. So the idea of a ban is that you have more flexibility of setting a ban in Varnish. So in a ban, you can say that everything that matches a particular regular expression, so you can match host headers or URLs, should be banned from the cache. But that means that every hit that comes into Varnish, so every new hit coming into Varnish, is going to be evaluated against this ban list. And if it gets a hit that should actually match your ban, it'll drop that from the cache and then request a new one. But it's a passive way in the sense that it is only going to be evaluated for every incoming hit to your Varnish instance. Whereas a purge, you send that actively to Varnish and actively will be purged from cache and freed memory instantly. Whereas a ban, you're going to want a hit on a particular page before a ban is actually in effect and before a page or an object within the cache is going to be removed from memory. Which is, I hope I'm explaining it accurately for listeners to understand what it does. I think it took me a while to understand how banning works. It's a really different concept of handling cache and invalidating content, but it's really powerful in the sense that you can use regular expressions. So you can say that everything that matches a .css file, but only on these 5 particular domains and only if a user has this cookie, then you can drop the cache and all the others can still use the existing cache. So it's really powerful, but with it comes a certain amount of complexity that you have to get used to.
Well, no, as you say, I mean, it is, as you say, the power of it being able to do that, and you don't have any upfront costs like a purge. You know, a purge will get rid of it at that time, and then it will have to refetch it then. But a ban is more a case of, yeah, well, I know now I don't want these to, I want to refetch these when I get them. Obviously, it will keep the other things in memory, and I think that's where, people would instantly assume, oh, a cache removal is really always going to be a removal, and I'm going to see the memory be freed immediately. But that's when ban maybe can get confusing because it's not actually removing it yet, because it's very passive. Like you said, it's not doing it until it actually has to, which on sites that are very busy and are very complex rules, that's a great thing. One thing actually I was going to ask you about is something, and it's called the ban lurker. And it's something I've only just really learnt about, and I'd love get your explanation on what actually is the ban lurker.
I love your explanation of just banning, by the way. It's better than mine. I'll stick to it.
No, yours was great, man.
The ban lurker solves a logical chicken or egg problem that occurs here, because bans are being set and they are marking particular objects in the cache for deletion as soon as someone tries to request it. But that obviously comes at a problem when you have pages that are never going to be requested again, because those are only evaluated for every hit that the Varnish is going to receive. It's the same thing with if you're going to be looking at your Google Analytics to find the pages that get 0 traffic, you're not going to find those in Google Analytics because you need at least a single hit before Google Analytics tracks it. Same happens here. You need at least a single hit in Varnish to drop a particular page via the ban. And the ban lurker is a concept where Varnish routinely goes over all the objects in its cache to trigger if ban logic. So even if a page is in cache and it's not likely to be hit again in the next 5 years, the ban lurker is going to fake such a hit so that it triggers the ban logic, and eventually the data does get purged from Varnish. So ban lurker is, it sounds really bad. It sounds a bit naughty, but the idea is that it is going to loop over all of your objects in the cache and decide or detect if a ban should be done on that particular object or not.
Another thing, actually, thinking about caching in general, and you mentioned, caching is one of the hardest problems. And one of the things with caching that people do come up with a lot is the concept like the cache stampede problem. When I'm asking for it and another person's asking for it at the same time, and we get a request and all these kind of things. I'm just wondering, how does Varnish actually handle those?
It handles those out of the box, which is really nicely for a caching product. It's something that when I first started implementing Varnish, I never thought about this problem because I never saw it in practice. So the idea is that if 10 people would hit the same website at the same time, Varnish is going to receive all of those 10 within, let's say, 3 or 4 seconds. The first hit that it gets, it will evaluate that for its cache to see if it can give you a cache hit or not. And it probably isn't going to give you a cache hit, so it has to fetch those from the backend. And every next hit that comes in requesting for the same page, Varnish is going to notice that it already sent a request to the backend requesting that particular page, which is nice because it can just block all of those other incoming requests instead of sending 10 requests to the backend. And as soon as that one hit from the backend comes in, it doesn't just send that to the one person requesting it, it sends that back to the 10 people that are waiting in line for that object. That obviously rises or falls with your hashing algorithm. If your hash is different for every request, you are going to be sending 10 different hits to the backend because that's what Varnish was instructed to do. But if it's the same object, if it's the same request coming in, and there is already a pending request being set onto the backend, it won't send 5 or 6 different requests. It will just wait for the first one to be done, which is good in a cache stampede problem because it won't give you the thundering herd. It won't overrun your backend.
Which is what you're trying to protect yourself against with Varnish.
Exactly, which would be a bit foolish to send them all to the backend. There is, of course, a logical consequence here that if that request, for whatever reason, is slow, because maybe it's talking to an external API or maybe the query being run on your database just happens to be a bit slower, you're going to be queuing a lot of users that might actually have been served faster if you had just sent multiple hits to the backend. Those might have been faster than waiting for the one slow hit. So there is that trade-off between solving a cache stampede versus accepting the consequences that go with it, being if that is a slow request, you might end up hanging those users a bit longer. So that is a trade-off that you just have to take.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really good point there. And another thing, actually, so, we have discussed quite a bit about, the concept of we brought Facebook up, Facebook with authentication and obviously I'm logged in, you're logged in, we're seeing different things. And what do we cache there? Is there any point in me caching, say, all my content? Like, would there be a point in me caching maybe my news feed that's going to change every time I refresh it? There's this concept called ESIs, and it'd be really interesting to get your thoughts on what an ESI is and also kind of how you can put them into practice.
I'd love to. ESI stands for an edge site include, which, if you've ever worked with PHP, is very comparable to just the include statement in PHP. Or if you go back further, in HTML, you had the server-side include option, where one piece of HTML could include different kinds of HTML. So basically, the PHP include, but then raw in HTML being handled server-side. So ESI is that concept, but handled within Varnish, which is a bit odd, because imagine that if you're going to facebook.com, you might not get a cache hit, so your Varnish is going to send that to the backend, to your PHP site. Your PHP site is going to send an HTML response, but instead of giving you, like you mentioned, an entire HTML response with a news feed and your hi Ed on the top left and your 5 friends on the top right, it's going to give you some kind of placeholder, different kind of HTML tags in the body of your response. which are essentially just empty tags. They just refer to different kinds of URLs that Varnish receives. Varnish looks inside of the body of that HTML. It detects those ESI requests, essentially, and it'll fire off on its own an ESI request for each of those sub-resources that you specified in the HTML body. So if you, say, had 5 sub-resources being set for your newsfeed and your private messages and your personal greeting, Varnish is going to send those 5 at the same time to the backend. And as soon as it receives those 5 responses, it'll assemble the HTML that it tried to assemble in memory and give you, the visitor, a page as if it is just a single HTML response. If you look at it that the way Facebook handles those things today, a lot of it is Ajax driven. ESI is essentially Ajax a bit on steroids. It is doing the Ajax stuff, but in memory of Varnish, and offering a single HTML response to the end user.
And I think this, again, is the beauty of how simple Varnish can be to how complex Varnish can be. Because when you start bringing things in like ESIs, you really are kind of playing around with how the application is structured and, like thinking really first class about how caching should be. What can be cached on a page and how can I kind of, break up a page into certain parts that can actually be cached and for how long. And this, all these things kind of have to be taken into consideration. Another thing actually we really cool to talk about is kind of what to cache. If things are very dynamic, there seems to be no point in caching them. And actually, one thing you did mention in the blog post was thinking twice about caching just static files. I'm just wondering kind of, what is your stance on what to cache and, how business specific is it?
If you're looking at Varnish, you probably have a problem you want to solve and you look at Varnish as a potential solution. So if your backend is running at 100% CPU usage, you're going to get a lot more benefit from caching your actual HTML and PHP hits versus caching all of your CSS or your JavaScript, because those are static files and yes, they cause a bit of load on your backend, whether it's network traffic or logging for all of the hits. It's going to be negligible compared to, say, your 2 or 3 second PHP page load consuming all of the CPU and memory of your MySQL server. So I think you have to look at Varnish and look at it as a tool to solve a problem. The way I looked at it at the beginning was I was trying to aim for the biggest possible cache hit ratio. I was aiming for the 99% cache hits, and that made me happy. And the easiest way to get that is just to make sure that every static piece of content on your site, every image, CSS or JavaScript, gets cached. Because on a typical page, you have like 10 or 20 of those. And even if the actual page doesn't get cached because the config is wrong, you're going to get really big cache hit rates because of all of the static content is going to get cached. But that doesn't solve your problem 9 times out of 10 because your backend is still dying for every PHP request that it receives. So I'm a big fan of actually caching static content after you've done all the rest. It's really easy to cache static files and it might give you a performance boost. But if it doesn't help you with speeding up the actual slow pages, it might have just been worthless. So you look at whatever it is that is hurting your servers, make sure that gets cached, and if then you have memory to spare in Varnish, throw in all the CSS or JavaScript and it will help with speeding up the delivery to your clients. But that's not going to make or break your site probably.
No, absolutely. Completely concur there. And I think, as you say, like the memory you've got is finite. And what is the problem you're trying to deal with is that application logic request. It's things like static files, they can go off to a CDN and they can be dealt with somewhere else. But the real logic and the reason why you're using something like Varnish is because you've got a problem with, processing computation that you need to somehow address.
Exactly. And if you have spare resources, throw everything in the cache. Of course, why not use it? Chances are you don't have spare resources, but which is why you should look at static content as a last resort. Even though I love the graphs where you see those 95% hit rates, in the end, it doesn't help you if your application is still dying on every hit.
Yeah, exactly. You can't really go to someone and say, no, it's fine because I've got the 99% cache hit ratio.
Exactly.
No, but it's still slow. It's like, no, but it's 99%. Like, it's just the wrong, it's the wrong percentage that I want. You really just want to deal with that 1% there.
Exactly.
That could actually save you. With Varnish, actually, Varnish is a great tool. And, you put it, you put it in front of, your typical Nginx or your Apache. One thing it doesn't deal with, though, is SSL. And that can be a bit of a hindrance, where now things obviously are moving over to SSL everywhere. And particularly, when we were talking about HTTP 2 last episode, SSL is everywhere and should be everywhere. How does Varnish get around that then? Because it is only just a HTTP protocol and it doesn't deal with anything to do with SSL.
Well, exactly. That is a bit of a hindrance, I think. Although Varnish 5 implemented the very basics of HTTP2, and if you remember, HTTP2 required HTTPS, but it still doesn't offer the SSL or the TLS part of HTTP2. So it's essentially still an HTTP-only proxy. Every time we deploy it, it's going to have an Nginx sitting in front of it, doing everything that is SSL or TLS related. Might be even Caddy doing the proxying, it might be an Apache doing the proxying. Something else is going to sit in front of your Varnish that handles whatever encryption mechanism or algorithm you want, which also adds an immediate cost to your infrastructure. It's obvious that if you're going to run Varnish, you might have an Apache, so you run Varnish in front of your Apache, but then you want HTTPS, so you're going to run something else in front of Varnish to handle HTTPS. It quickly adds up to a technical stack to admire, but also to maintain. And that is a cost, that you have. It's a trade-off you have to keep in mind. But Varnish in itself doesn't handle HTTPS. It's always going to be something else sitting in front of it. Now they have, or the Varnish project, the folks behind Varnish, have their own TLS proxy. It's called Hitch. I don't actually have any first-hand experience with it because I enjoy and really like Nginx as a reverse proxy. But if it is as efficient and smart as Varnish is, I think it's a good choice. Just it's not something that I have a lot of experience with.
Yeah, it's very interesting why, they haven't decided to do that. I mean, obviously it must be a simpler goal to just handle HTTP flat out plain. But, to not add that in kind of does, add. It's not only saying, we need to add Varnish in front of our stack. We now need to add Varnish and another level just to get rid of the TLS. It's an interesting one.
Well, it's good news for managed hosting providers like us, where we can manage the infrastructure. But I agree, in a way, it follows the Unix philosophy of making a single tool that does a single thing really good. They have Varnish, which handles HTTP really well. They have Hitch, which probably handles HTTPS really well. But there's not a single tool that handles both really well. So there's an area to be filled, obviously.
And actually, that leads on to the next question, which is, are there any alternatives to Varnish? Because something like looking into Nginx, and Nginx does provide maybe quite a lot more. It does the stripping of TLS, SSL, and it also can do some rudimentary caching stuff. I'm just wondering, kind of any experiences using Nginx in that form or any other products?
If you're looking at open source solutions, there's nothing that comes close to Varnish, I think. Yes, Nginx has a caching solution, but it doesn't give you the same flexibility that you have in Varnish. It doesn't allow you to mess inside of each request and response the way Varnish does. But if you're already running Nginx and you want perhaps a more basic, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but just a more simpler caching strategy, I think letting Nginx handle your cache is probably a good first choice. It is going to make your infrastructure a lot less complicated than adding yet another proxy in front of it. For the same reason that Apache can also start caching your files. So there are a lot of alternatives, but if you want to raw power, nothing comes close to Varnish. You have commercial solutions, you have your F5 big IP caching solutions, but I think those start at like 50 grand or more. You need a big wallet to get started with the commercial solutions.
It soon mounts up for sure. And to say thank you so much, Mattias, for coming on the show. I only got two other questions just before we leave. The first one I have to ask is kind of like, you did release, you actually started a podcast after our last podcast, actually, Syscast, and I really enjoyed it. Like every episode, I downloaded it immediately and enjoyed them. I'm just wondering, kind of like, what was your experience with creating a podcast, and do you have any show topics lined up?
I wish I had. I have a lot of ideas, but I noticed making a podcast is incredibly hard and requires a lot of planning and dedication. So hat off to you and the rest of your crew. You've been doing this for way too long and you keep on doing it. I like writing blog posts. It's something that you can do for like 10 minutes and then drop and then pick it up an hour later and then perhaps drop it a few days and then pick it up again. That is not an option in podcasting. You dedicate an hour or more and you just go all in. And if a baby starts crying halfway, you might just have to do the entire recording again. So it's really intensive, and I underestimated that. I thought it would be easy to just start a podcast, yay, everybody happy. But it's not. It's a scheduling mess, which, again, sorry for this one, rescheduling all the way. But it's intensive. There are time zones. You have to schedule things. You have to get some kind of room where you're not disturbed every 5 minutes. I've put the podcast on hold for a bit. thanks for enjoying the previous episode. I hope to pick it up again, but so far it's been a bit too intensive to combine with the 15 other side projects.
I was thinking you've got fair whack on already. I think adding a podcast in it, I mean, this is the only thing I do as a side thing. So yeah, and I mean, I've tried to leave podcasting, but it is very addictive, and you get to talk to great people like you. So it's, a very valuable resource.
It is very addictive, isn't it? It gives you... It's amazing how many people say yes to come onto a podcast. I had guests which run really big open source companies that I thought were totally unapproachable until you mention the podcast, and then they're like, "Oh, that sounds interesting. I'll talk to you." It opens doors, definitely.
Absolutely. And actually, talking about one of the other side projects you have going on, and it's called DNS Spy, and I'm really interested in this product. Like, so what actually does this solve?
It solves a particular problem that I had. So, a bit of background: I work at Nucleus. We're a managed hosting provider, so we manage infrastructure where other people will put their websites on. And part of that is building new infrastructures where clients can deploy an existing website or migrate to us. That always involved a bit of timing because you have to schedule migrations, you have to time it with developers. But I quickly learned that doesn't really work that way. And then developers or managers or whoever basically decide on a whim to move their DNS to points to us, and suddenly we're receiving loads of traffic that we never saw coming. So I built, I think it's already 5 or 6 years ago, a small bash script that just notified me whenever a DNS or a domain that I was interested in changed the DNS. That could be because I wanted to monitor my competitors to see what they were doing, or whenever a client of ours would go live. And that actually was still running up until a few months ago. So it added actual value for me to know when DNSs changed or when outages occurred. And I decided to build a commercial application around it called DNS Spy, which only deals with DNS. But I think if you're a developer and you have a website ready to go and you've sent a DNS change request to your client and it has to talk to its provider and it takes a while and you're hitting refresh and the site doesn't come live, all because you're just waiting for a DNS change, I think that is where DNS Spy could come in and just send you a notification that, hey, the DNS actually changed, without dealing with all the resolver caching, etc. Just looking at the source name servers. If they changed, you get notified, and that's the way it works. But I found it to be really useful for both myself and the clients that I've been having. So it's been interesting as well to play with Varnish, Laravel, and Laravel Spark, the business side of it. It's been good or fun to be diving back into the PHP and development world. It's been a while, so that was a fun intro back.
Yeah, because I was going to ask actually, like, kind of what is the stack that you're using? I know you're using Laravel there and Laravel Spark, but like, is it still just a bash script that's going around, or have you kind of expanded on that?
It's become a really, really fancy bash script. So in the end, all the processing, everything that's going on is raw PHP because that is my go-to language and it's what I know best. But it spawns out shell scripts wherever needed to get raw performance. In the end, it's not really complicated. It's a lot of PHP, it's a lot of bash and shell scripting. And I've been toying in my head to do some rewriting in Go because the concurrency model of Go seems absolutely brilliant for this. But then I always come back to it. That takes time. And for me right now, it's easier to add server resources and a lot cheaper to add server resources than it is to be rewriting a core function of my application. So there's always that trade-off. But most of it is just plain old PHP, Laravel Spark. I think has been the best investment I've made in the last year. It actually allowed me to get this going in the first place, adding payments, user account management, billing, invoicing. None of those things I actually want to build, but Spark...
Out of the box.
Just out of the box, I think $100 for a single site license one time, and you get all of that for free, which it would have cost me months to build. It's really hat off to Taylor for Spark. It's an amazing product.
No, absolutely. And Mattias, thank you again so much for coming on the show. I really do appreciate it. It's been really, really fun and interesting just talking about all this stuff with you.
It's been my absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No, absolutely, Matt. I say we definitely have to do this again sooner than 2 years for sure.
We'll schedule it. If I ever come to England, I'll just come by.
Absolutely, that would be perfect. We'll have no network problems there at all. All right then, audience. Well, it's been another great episode, and we'll speak to you again next week. Goodbye.
You've been listening to 3 Devs and a Maybe. You can contact us at contact@3devsandamaybe.com or follow us on Twitter @3 Devs and a Maybe.